And we're live. It is Tuesday, January 28th, 8 o'clock a.m., the year of our Lord, many of our Lords, 2024. The sun, it's not really shining. It's got a kind of big overlay of clouds that the sun is peeking through, but the birds are chirping, and it's going to be a great freaking day because, Mr. Cactus,
You're watching Dog Shirt TV, an effing revolution in morning television.
that's right. It is Dog Shirt TV, and it is an effing revolution in morning television. And let me tell you a little bit about its revolutionary nature. Because there are not very many shows that you can wake up with COVID, as I did this morning, and receive a text that was sent last night about a giant new wave of impoundment by the federal government and say, maybe we should do an impoundment show in an hour with COVID. And then you can text Nastia and say, hey, do you want to come on and talk about the impact of the foreign aid uh, uh, impoundments on Ukrainian media? And she'd be like, sure. And then you can text Steve Vladek and say, do you want to come on and talk about this newest affront to, this freeze on all federal grants? And Steve can be like, well, sure, but I'll be driving. And I can't do until sort of 8:30 or 8:45. I'm not sure when, and it'll be audio only. And you're like, frickin' fine. We'll talk to Nasty in the first half of the hour. We'll talk to Steve in the second half of the hour. And all of a sudden, you have a show, and it's a super substantive show that nobody else can really put together. And all I have to do is sit here and sweat virus because, yes, I am sick with the other virus that's going around this week, not the Trump presidency, but the COVID virus. So,
Can I just make a brief announcement, Ben?
Yes, Holly has a brief announcement.
I also sent you last night. I made a new parody. To be honest, it's not that funny, but I feel like it is piercing commentary on our times. It is a Taylor Swift song for those who are Swifties, and it was vocally challenging because there's a lot of background vocals required, and it's also it's a long song. So I felt that it was an achievement, even though it's not like the funniest one. It's more like a searing commentary on America.
Yeah. So, well, I will listen to that later today, and
my YouTube. Molly Berkley Fletcher.
Molly Berkley Fletcher. Yes.
Elon thinks this one is bizarre. It has it's about him.
If it doesn't get an Elon tweet, Holly, you will have not lived up to your potential.
Yeah, well, I'm not on Twitter anymore. So someone else, your job, Greek Chorus, if anyone is on Twitter still, your job is to put it on Twitter and tag Elon
and Charlie Kirk. Right? Yeah, because Charlie Kirk is the feeder dude to Elon.
Their friend Molly has stepped in. This one is honestly bizarre and not really corny, but it's a little embarrassing. But you try things, you do it for fun. I needed to pick me up. I made a parody. I put it out there. As you know, Ben, perfection is the enemy of good.
It's also the enemy of productivity.
Yeah.
Imperfection, getting stuff out when it's good enough.
Yeah.
Is
another achievement, and then I will shut up. I promise. I used the word farrago. I rhymed farrago with Mar-a-Lago.
Oh, that is good.
What does that mean for the non-English natives?
Farrago is, I don't know, it has various meanings. I use it as kind of just a cluster F of kind of bad ideas and What would you say, Ben?
Well, rather than what I would say, let us actually look it up.
It had a specific definition that was just too, you know how like words sometimes have a really overly specific definition and then it has like a more general definition. Obviously, this is the more general one.
Yeah, it's a confused mixture, is
Mhm.
how
Kind of like
uh
your brain today.
yeah, exactly. Except it's not sweating virus the way I am. All right, Nastya,
Yes. Hi.
welcome back.
I just rushed from a cafe on the other side of town to do this, so.
That is awesome, and I like the way the lights are kind of haloing your head.
By the
It's
way, is this annoying that they keep...
no, it's awesome. It
Okay.
gives you a kind of
I'm still
like
in Christmas.
tiara look.
You look like
Um,
an angel. You look like an angel.
Thank you.
so the theme of today is wiping out perfectly good organizations domestically and abroad with the stroke of a presidential pen.
Yep.
And so most people, when they read about the foreign aid cutoff, did not think, for example, that the consequence might be to free a whole lot of ISIS people because the prison guards in the camps in where the SDF are holding ISIS people in Syria are all funded by U.S. foreign aid, and so they're
Yes.
not getting paid, so
No,
they're not showing up to work, and so we're gonna have more to say about that,
it's
but
definitely worse than whatever I have to say.
okay, so just so that people don't think I'm making this up, the estimable Charles Lister at the Middle East Institute tweeted about this or blue skied about it yesterday. He is a superb Syria analyst and knows a lot about it. So we're sort of tracking weird effects on like that people don't think of as foreign aid, but in fact are. And you texted me last night with the fact that this is unsurprising, but it will nonetheless surprise a lot of people that this is having a huge and immediate effect on, of all things, Ukrainian media. And so, or independent Ukrainian media. So, first of all, talk about who it's affecting and how and what it is doing. And then we're going to get into a little bit of the why.
Well, so it's actually kind of impossible to summarize who exactly is being affected by this Trump's decision to freeze or pause all foreign aid or USAID aid for 90 days, because there's like, it seems like there's every sector of the Ukrainian society that somehow relies on this aid. I mean, if you're attempting to describe the kind of projects that use USAID money, it's like projects in the energy sector, projects in the agricultural sector, like Ukrainian farmers who get good quality seeds for their crops using this American funding. It's rebuilding Ukrainian schools that are damaged by Russian attacks. It's rebuilding the energy infrastructure that's damaged by Russian attacks. Rehabilitation and mental health support for veterans, for all sorts of vulnerable groups that are affected by war. I mean, dozens, if not hundreds, Ukrainian media outlets, both local and large. Some of the biggest Ukrainian independent outlets are funded with American money. I mean, it's honestly everywhere, and I wrote a piece about this for my Substack.
And remind us, Nastya, what is your Substack called?
Yes, my Substack is called Yours Ukrainian. I have a weekly key news of the week in Ukraine kind of thing, briefing, and then I also write occasional essays on various topics. So this is an example of that kind of thing where something happens and I dive into it. So for like since the morning, and it's now 3 p.m. here in Kyiv. All morning I've been trying to track just on social media and in my bubble just how wide this is, and it's impossible to really pin down because the more you look into it, the more the effects emerge. I mean,
and so far, what have the effects been? Are organizations freezing programming? Are they shutting down?
Yes.
Like what happens when the U.S. federal government says, without reference to Ukraine, you know, by the way, we're pausing all foreign aid for 90 days. What's the on the ground effect of that?
Right. So, there have been a lot of media outlets that have posted on social media, just kind of pleas for help, asking for their readers to support them, saying that, in some cases, 80% of their budget was covered by American money. I mean, that's huge. In some cases more, in some cases less. And it's really quite shocking to read. For example, there is a very famous Ukrainian outlet called Ukrainer. It's a Ukrainian outlet, but it works kind of in many languages because one of its ideas is to tell the world and the international community about Ukraine. And it does these amazing expeditions, like basically road trips all around Ukraine, showing the culture, the geography, that kind of stuff. And their editor-in-chief and founder, Bogdan Logvinenko, he posted a very sad Facebook post where he was like, look, these amazing expeditions, which are the things that kind of made us famous, and this is what you guys love us for, the vast majority of that was only made possible because we had American money, and we no longer can do that in the foreseeable future. He said, we will continue doing our YouTube interviews, but we're likely going to have to resort to kind of not clickbaity, but we're going to have to interview more famous, like media famous people, because we're going to need advertising money, and advertisers don't really care about the content or, like the really smart but less known people. They care about the clicks. So we're going to have to reorient a part of our work to chasing the clicks because that's where the money is, because now we don't have American money. There has been also a statement done by the Veteran Hub. It's this large Ukrainian network that supports veterans in Ukraine and their families. It provides legal help, help with reintegration after the war, things like that. And they said that they've completely halted the operations of their crisis hotline, and also completely halted an operation of their office in their space in one of Ukrainian cities. So they're not completely shut down, but it's still a huge effect. And so this kind of stuff is like really scary because I knew that a lot of us relied on American money this much, but even I, as the person who is a journalist in Ukraine, seeing the struggle firsthand, struggle for funding, even I didn't expect that, it could happen like this. So it's
Yeah,
really
so Steve Vladek, the very estimable Steve Vladek, has shown up earlier than expected, which is, by the way, to all of you out there, a model of how you should behave with respect to being a guest on Dogshirt TV. That is, when you get a text and you're supposed to be driving your wife to the train station,
Drive faster.
Drive faster, ditch the wife, do whatever you have to do to get to your
Must have trailed
no,
the presidential motorcade or something.
yeah, exactly.
Get that motorcade.
Karen, that was a joke.
Pro tip.
So Steve, I was planning on segregating the domestic part of this conversation from the foreign policy part of the conversation, but since you're here, let's integrate them. Is what Nastia is talking about an impoundment within the meaning of the Impoundment Control Act?
Yep, it sure is. And this is not close. The best possible argument against it being an impoundment, and we'll get separately to the legal implications, is that it's temporary. But one of the things that the Impoundment Control Act specifically does is clarify what had to that point in 1974 been an open question about whether to be an impoundment it has to be permanent. The statute says delays count. And no matter what you want to call this, it is at the very least a delay in the expenditure of appropriated funds.
Okay, so
question, if I can jump in, like how I worked in government, so I have some concept of how bureaucracy, how slow bureaucracy and the wheels turn. Like, so the freeze is just like immediate, like overnight?
There was literally a stop work order.
So
Okay,
I mean
I got that.
the
But
memo.
then to turn-
Sorry, I mean the memo says as of 5 p.m. today. Now,
That's shocking efficiency.
well, and so one of the complications here, right, is that, and you know this well from your experience, the government is a they, not an it, right? And so what we're really talking about is not OMB turning off the spigot. It's OMB telling every agency to independently turn off their spigots. And it's possible, Holly, that some of them won't. I mean, not many, but so part of what's going to be messy today, tomorrow, this week is whether the reaction across agencies is going to be uniform, or whether some folks try to use the language in the memo, right, subject to applicable law, to say, well, this is not subject to applicable law, so we're not doing it. I mean, that's one of the complications, is that OMB is only the sort of umbrella organization. What are each of the actual funding distribution agencies going to do with this?
Right, but the issue that Nastia was talking about was the earlier State Department AID freeze on foreign aid. And I guess what I can't figure out is whether the OMB memo is effectively doing the same thing at the domestic level, or whether there's some meaningful difference legally or between the Rubio memo and the OMB memo.
So I think two things are true. One, I think there's a little more discretion historically in some of the State Department's funding statutes. And Ben, there is a whole literature and a whole fight, right, about where the line is between impoundment and the exercise of statutorily conferred spending discretion. The other is, like, if I were the Trump administration,
and just to be clear to those who haven't spent quality time with the constitutional law of federal spending, which is to say everybody. What you mean by that, I take it, is that a spending statute can be written in basically one of several ways. Either the president shall spend X number of dollars on, redecorating Holly's house, or the president may spend up to X dollars redecorating Ev's apartment, or the president shall spend no more than X, right?
Or the president may spend up to X if he finds that certain conditions are met.
Right. And so the specific wording of the specific statute becomes very important to whether an impoundment is presumptively legal or presumptively illegal.
And there's one more. I'm sorry, Holly. Can I just throw in one more piece really quickly? And the one other piece of this is, the Impoundment Control Act, ironically, I think it's misunderstood by a lot of folks. It actually provides a modicum of impoundment authority. Right, it creates a procedure for the president to impound some funds, but Ben, not for the first category you mentioned, right? So the Impoundment Control Act expressly precludes any impoundment of mandatory spending. If it's mandatory, there's no mechanism under the Constitution, under the Impoundment Control Act, for the president to do anything but spend the money.
Ben, can we delegalize that? What? Like, in practice, does that mean that what Trump did is illegal or something?
I would say two things. One, it is absolutely illegal. It is probably unconstitutional, although we may never find out because it's going to be litigated principally on the question of whether it's illegal. And I think what's going to happen, and I wrote about this in a post for my newsletter.
And what is your Substack called, Steve?
One First. Which is not nearly as usefully descriptive a title as Nastia's. What's almost certainly going to happen now, right, is that there's going to be litigation, right, and the litigation is going to probably get to the Supreme Court pretty quickly, because you're going to have some court somewhere that purports to say that much, if not most, of this is unlawful, right, and then the Trump administration is going to take that up. The complication here, right, is that the Impoundment Control Act actually does create a mechanism for Trump to impound a lot of money. And, Ben, I would have thought if I were the Trump administration and I wanted to pick this fight, right, foreign aid is where I would have picked this fight, because at least there are some arguments about the president's inherent constitutional power. But to do this through an across the board, completely unnuanced, turn all of the money off memo from, the acting head of OMB is exactly the way you lose this case, not the way you win it.
So my next question was, how quickly can it be turned back on? Just like again overnight, or is there a process?
Let's do an antecedent question. Since the foreign aid stuff is a week ahead of the other stuff on this, Nastia, how long do organizations have before they totally collapse without this getting turned back on?
That's a hard question. I mean, it all depends on a case-by-case basis, because like I've literally 2 minutes ago, I was, going back into the rabbit hole of tracking how many people were affected. And one media organization, a pretty small one, but an influential one nevertheless, said that they actually weren't that impacted because they relied on other funding sources. Let's not forget that the EU does a bunch of funding programs as well. There are individual countries like, embassies, Norwegian embassies, Danish embassies. They're pretty active in Ukraine as well. So, this outlet was saying that they're fine. I mean, they're not happy about it, but they're fine. So, I mean, for some, it's going to be really hard. But the one thing that I hope for is, one, that it's going to come back on, that the money is going to keep flowing. I think I've seen a report that in one country, I want to say it was Bangladesh, that somewhere in one country where USAID was very active, that programs already came back on, some programs, that like the review already completed and they're already back on. So that's pretty quick and swift. Hopefully the same is going to happen for Ukrainian programs, but we don't know, because the review processes to determine whether all of these programs fit within Trump's foreign policy and the America First agenda, which is literally what the State Department press briefing said. And
since nobody knows what Trump's foreign policy toward Ukraine is,
exactly,
it's a little bit hard to figure out how things align.
Exactly.
Except that there should be no war.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's anyone's guess whether supporting Ukrainian journalists falls under the America First agenda. Probably not. So it's really quite sad.
So all right. So Steve, next question. What is the scope of the domestic order? I read through it briefly last night, and it seems to me it covers everything from scientific cancer research, to feeding the hungry through any program that gets federal money that's, a private sector, to basically anything that involves an organization that's not a contractor, a business. You're fine if you're a Beltway bandit, but if you're a nonprofit organization, you're not, no matter what the subject is. So if you're a NASA contractor who's nonprofit, you're frozen. But if you're Elon Musk, you're fine. Is that basically what we're talking about here?
Yeah, and I'll say, I mean, the memo, suffice it to say, the memo is not exactly clear on this subject, and I suspect that have already been a lot of panicked calls from agency general counsels to OMB. The memo tries to draw a line, Ben, between institutions and entities that receive federal financial assistance and individuals who directly receive federal financial assistance. So that clearly, I think, is intended to carve out Medicare and Social Security, which otherwise are, federal benefit programs that depend upon, grants of money from Congress. But the rest of it, I mean, Ben, there's no subject matter specificity. There's no amount, minimum or maximum, right? And so, I think the other piece of this is the impact on colleges and universities. I mean, colleges and universities receive a ton of federal financial assistance. And one thing that's not clear on the face of the order is whether student loans count as grants, right, that go to institutions, because at least some of them are dispersed through the universities, not directly to the recipients. So,
and the universities are, except for like Strayer College, nonprofit organizations, non-governmental organizations, clearly within the meaning of the...
many are non-governmental. I was just employed by the University of Texas, which is very governmental.
Yes.
Right? But I think that a lot of today is going to be chaos about who's covered and who's not, and that's probably going to have to be handled on an agency by agency level. But again, I mean, I think the reason why folks were so slow to react when the news first started leaking out yesterday is because no one could believe it was as broad as it says it is. And yet, in the light of day, it sure seems to be.
Bloomberg just reported that Hexeth halted all new army procurement contracts for at least 10 days, but could last for months as well.
And not say the contracts raises a whole separate bevy of issues, because
Okay.
the sort of, I mean, so there are sort of three ways you get money from the government, right? One, you contract with the government and the government pays you, right? Two, the government agrees through its beneficence to give you money for some program that they've decided to pay you for. Three, the government owes you money because it wronged you, right? Like torts, right? And, this is principally what we're talking about, the OMB order, is principally category 2. But if the government stops honoring its contracts, it is inviting just a universe of litigation. Now, some of those contracts, Nastia, might have provisions that allow for temporary suspensions of payment, right? That's something that's going to have to be, fleshed out in the next couple of days. But if it doesn't, then the government's in breach, and it's liable to be sued, up the yin-yang for not honoring its contracts.
I mean,
All right. I just want to say before we go on, I just noticed that every single person on this live stream has a Substack. And so I have added everybody's Substack to their...
Here's Evs. Ev, do you have a Substack?
Evs does have a Substack.
I don't see Ev's Substack on her.
I don't see it either.
Oh, well, it's... I just thought I added it. Ev, add your Substack to your, if it's not already there, because it is on my screen.
Oh, the other thing I just will add, and I'm literally hearing from friends as we're sitting here, is that, all the government workers who are in charge of these programs and are associated with such programs. And by the way, like aid, it's domestic programs too, and it's very broad. I've been surprised to hear what sort of falls under this purview. But they're all they're probably going to be sent home. So on admin leave for now.
Yes, there are definitely people across the community at AID and elsewhere who are being sent home on administrative leave. And of course, we haven't yet talked about the actual firing of 12 Justice Department lawyers who worked on the Trump prosecution and were fired yesterday, pretty clearly illegally. So let's talk about the litigation prospects here, because one thing you can't do is cut off money to thousands of organizations nationwide and internationally without creating a lot of plaintiffs.
I did hold myself back when I saw that piece of news, and I posted on my Instagram story that, like, if I hear any Republican complain about democratic backsliding in Ukraine again, like, help me God, hearing that commentary.
Nastia, Ben, can I say, before we get to litigation, I mean, I do think it's worth underscoring why people like me are reacting the way we are, right? Which is, I mean, Nastia is right about the democratic backsliding piece. Like, impoundment is not just one of dozens of flashpoints in the separation of powers between Congress and the executive branch. Impoundment is basically the executive claiming Congress's single most important power.
And walk us through that for people who who impoundment sounds like a sort of technical dispute about whether you must or whether you may do spending and a kind of with a kind of mother may I.
Right.
But it's actually the tectonic plates of the entire congressional executive relationship. Like, for those who, who haven't read the Federalist Papers recently, why is impoundment such a big deal?
Because if I can be a little bit sort of pithy, because the king used to do it and Parliament hated it. Right? I mean, one of the grievances in the Declaration of Rights in 1689 in the English Bill of Rights was basically that the king was impounding money. Right? That it was sort of baked into why colonial legislatures were so important to governance, and we're often it's why the founders were wary of a strong executive, not just on the military side, but on this side too, right? And I think people tend to sort of get a bit thrown off by the notion that the Constitution generally gives the president discretion in the enforcement of federal law, right? So we know there's prosecutorial discretion. The president does not have to charge every criminal with every crime they've committed. But spending is different because Congress is the one who decides whether the money has strings, whether the money, as we talked about, has tags, or whether it must be spent. And for the president to say, I have discretion to not spend money that Congress said must be spent, is for the president to aggrandize and arrogate to himself the spending power, which, Ben, not to be sort of a con law nerd, it's literally the first power the Constitution gives to Congress in Article 1, Section 8.
I can do it more pithily, Steve.
Okay.
All right? We all learned in grade school Congress has the purse strings, right? The impoundment question is whether Congress has both of the purse strings or only one of them, and whether the president gets one.
All right, that's pithier.
That's pithier, right?
Well, I mean, just watching the last few years, I'm sure that Congress is going to want its power back because, they clearly cherish their power. Yeah. And they really, they take this very seriously. And so I just have full confidence that Congress is going to have something to say about this.
So, Holly, of course, you're right to be completely sarcastic about this. I do think it's telling, though, that even this administration and with this Congress is not trying to go the route the statute provides, which is to say, hey, Congress, we want to impound all of this money, right? You have 45 days to stop us. Even this administration is not picking that fight, which I think is revealing. Ben, on the litigation front, the only thing I'll sort of flag that might be unusual to folks who otherwise have some awareness of how U.S. civil litigation works is because these are all going to be monetary claims against the federal government. A lot of them are going to end up in a court many people have never heard of, called the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. Which is a federal, it's a perfectly, federal court here in Washington that handles
known for its fast docket.
Indeed,
too.
That handles but that handles large dollar claims, large dollar non-tort claims against the United States. Now, there's a statute literally known as the Little Tucker Act, which says you can go to any federal district court anywhere in the country if your claim is for less than $10,000. And so it's possible that there will be some small organizations affected by this freeze who might avail themselves of that. But Ben, the big stuff is all going to go to the Court of Federal Claims. And from there,
but even the injunctive stuff?
So maybe not. I mean, right, maybe not. But the problem is that, I think there are going to be some plaintiffs who are going to be wary about having to litigate whether they're in the right court. And so they'll go to the Court of Federal Claims just to make sure there's no question.
Interesting. And so I would normally expect that to happen today.
If there are not multiple lawsuits challenging this filed by this afternoon, I would be floored.
And in all of these situations, one expects this is for those who don't know, a subject about which Steve wrote a whole book. So we're walking into Steve's the sweet spot of Steve's territory here. Um, I would expect this would be dealt with on the in a kind of emergency docket, sort of what you call the I'm sorry, my
shadow
COVID
docket.
brain is the shadow docket. I was going to say the secret docket. It doesn't sound right. But you're going to have a request for a temporary restraining order and then a preliminary injunction, and all of that's going to happen super fast, and it's going to end up before the Supreme Court on some crazy standard. Does like so and so have a likelihood of success when they later claim that this is an impoundment? And the question is, am I wrong about that, or is that how it's likely to play out?
You're not wrong. That's exactly how it's likely to play out. And it's worth saying, I think, two things here. The first is, if it only gets resolved in that posture, that is to say, an emergency application, like, hey, what should the status quo be while we sort out these complicated legal questions, then it will really matter who won last before the case gets to the Supreme Court. Right? That to win an emergency application in the Supreme Court requires more than just being right on the merits. And so if, for example, the federal circuit, the appeals court that hears appeals from the Court of Federal Claims, or one of the geographic courts of appeals, rules against Trump, the onus is going to be on Trump, right, to get the Supreme Court to undo that ruling. The other thing I'll say, though, Ben, is this court has shown a remarkable propensity in cases like this, with this amount of urgency and importance, to sort of jump over the temporary emergency litigation piece of this and just hustle like crazy to resolve the merits. I mean, we just saw this with TikTok, where instead of resolving, controversial emergency applications about the TikTok statute, the court deferred those applications and scheduled hyper-expedited briefing and oral argument for a full ruling on whether the statute was constitutional. I think that's probably how this ends.
Although that wouldn't be a bad thing in this case, right?
I don't think so. I mean, I will say this. I mean, I get a lot of flack every time I talk about why Trump is going to lose something in the courts, from people who have just given up any hope in the notion that this Supreme Court is ever going to rule against Trump. And I'll just say, I understand where that cynicism comes from, but this is not the case for Trump. I mean, impoundment has not historically been part of the conservative legal movement. It is not part of the unitary executive theory of presidential power.
Strongly associated with Watergate and Richard Nixon in the worst possible way.
The founding era materials are pretty decisively in Congress's favor on this score. I mean, the court might have some qualms about just how far Congress can go by statute, but there's, maybe at most you can squint and find 3 votes on the Supreme Court for a presidential impoundment power. But Ben, even the Office of Legal Counsel, which is the DOJ office that tends to write the most pro-executive power opinions you can imagine, has a very strong memo from 1988 during the Reagan administration.
Must have been polled, right, the other day?
I mean, probably.
For this to issue.
Probably, but the memo says there is no inherent impoundment power. Now, maybe the position in the Trump administration that this is not impoundment because it's temporary, but that too is not going to work.
And critical question before, is the foreign policy order from a week ago differently situated from the one yesterday in this regard because of inherent presidential powers in foreign policy? Or should we think of this all as just one big OMB, Marco Rubio, whoever tells their agency or the relevant agencies, stop spending money that Congress has appropriated, and it's all one question, whether you're a Ukrainian media organization or a domestic service provider of homeless shelters. It's all the same question.
So I think it is probably all the same question. with the possible exception of whether there's language in some of the State Department appropriation statutes that gives the executive branch a little more wiggle room to argue that what they're doing is not impoundment. What they're doing is exercising delegated control over spending that Congress has authorized them. If that doesn't exist, and Ben, I just don't know the answer to that question. If that doesn't exist, it's the same question.
Well, it probably exists in some situations and not in others, because remember, these are dozens and dozens and dozens of statutes that are each written differently. And under those statutes, thousands of contracts that are each written differently, right? And so, but I guess what I'm trying to figure out, and I think you've answered that question, is like, should we assume that this is 10,000 different litigations or one big consolidated question? And it sounds like at least at first we're thinking about one big consolidated question.
Right. I mean, my suspicion is there will be hundreds of lawsuits. And that one of the challenges for the courts, and especially for the Supreme Court, will be figuring out how to most efficiently deal with this. But on the broad question, I mean, again, on the broad question of can the government just announce an across-the-board freeze in all grants, right? That question will solve, Ben, probably, like, if the answer to that question is no, then that question will resolve most of those lawsuits. And then there might be some specific ones about contractual language or agency-specific discretion in spending statutes, where maybe the lower courts have a bit of a harder time sorting through the mess.
All right. So, Nastia, when you listen to all of that, some of which is legalistic Greek and some of which is comprehensible, does this make you feel more or less worried for Ukrainian civil society organizations, media organizations, and other recipients of U.S. aid?
I kind of think I'm equally worried. Same level of worried as I was before this conversation, because, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't understand Trump and American politics as well as all of you do, but it seems like...
We don't understand it either. This is all new to us.
But from everything that I know, it seems like, I mean, the courts, the justice system, like, none of that matters. I mean, it matters to a degree, but if Trump wants to freeze foreign aid, he will freeze foreign aid. Like, they will find, like, Stephen Miller will find a way to do it, circumventing the courts and the justice system. So it's all kind of, like, it all sounds like a fever dream. And I know I'm not even an American, so what do, like...
Hey, man, I have COVID. I am actually experiencing fever dreams. So
I mean, just
it's
like
hard to tell the difference sometimes.
the fact that America is like reverting to this state, like, it's so crazy, right? Like, as a Ukrainian, my whole life, I grew up thinking of the US as like this incredible standard of what a world should look like and how a world should work, right? Like,
It's the way we think of Canada.
I mean, I was 13 when we had the Revolution of Dignity. So, like, it's imprinted in my mind that we want to be a part of the West, that we want to be with the US. It's like, it's in my blood that America is our biggest ally, like all of these ideological things. And to see all of this shit happen, excuse my language, like, it's so just like unbelievable that, like, that this is the standard that I grew up believing in.
And
If ever there were a use of shit, that would be appropriate.
Thank you.
And if the Supreme Court on the shadow docket within the next 3 weeks says, no, you can't do that, does that restore faith, or is that merely the mere act of the President of the United States doing the full Viktor Orban dance is itself the loss of faith?
Was this to me?
Yeah.
I thought that wasn't a me question because there was a lot of legal speak there.
No, it was
like tuned out when you said the word docket. I was like, okay, that's not a question for me.
No, I meant it to you. Like, does the availability of a remedy when the president behaves like Viktor Orban, is that part of the picture for you, or is the picture is basically American presidents shouldn't don't behave like this, and now we know they do?
I mean, I think it's the latter. I think this is like history changing and history shifting. Like, because this is gonna sound really bad, but it's like the conversations about Trump are slightly similar, actually very similar to me, to conversations that Ukrainians have about Russia, in a way that when people say that, we just have to outlive Putin and things are going to get better, you'll hear every Ukrainian say, well, you don't know, because it's not just Putin. There is a whole system, there is a whole community, and there might be someone worse. There might be Patrushev, there might be anyone else after Putin who's going to be worse. And so this is kind of how I feel about Trump. Like, we can talk about the fact that it's just Trump, but then there's also the entire party that's basically now a Trump party. You know this better than I do, again, that like even after he's out, which hopefully he's not gonna figure out some way to like do another third term or something, even after he's out, there's gonna be a whole generation of people just like him who might even do worse things, right? So it's honestly very depressing. I told you that when I was watching not nomination, confirmation hearings, I watched some of them, and again, all of that reminded me so much of like Russia or Belarus and their political processes, because I was like, all of this is just to show. Like, everyone knows what the facts are. Everyone knows that the accusations are valid. Everyone knows that it's not a liberal information operation or whatever it is that they said it was. Like, everyone knows the truth, but each part, like every player is just playing their part, right? Like, the nominee just nods and talks about how Trump is great. The Democrats accuse, the Republicans flatter, and like everyone plays their part, and it's all and none of it matters, because at the end everyone knows that the result is predetermined. And that reminded me so much of the Russian system, that they hold elections, they hold all of these open mics questions for the president, but none of it matters because everyone knows what the result is going to be.
So once upon a time, I was talking to somebody who I'm going to keep names out of this, who later became a very, very senior uh, administration official. And this person was describing to me the difficulty of running from the Justice Department, what the component that was then called the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and is now no longer in the Justice Department, but is now called CBP. And the person described it as, you're sitting in front of a giant switchboard with lots of dials and levers and switches, and you're manically pressing buttons and throwing switches and changing dials. And then all of a sudden you realize that it's the switchboard is not connected to anything underneath. And that is, the performance of democracy in the absence of the reality. We're going to learn a lot more about that this week, because we have three nominees, and I wrote my column about this yesterday, three nominees who are in different ways completely deranged, and in a way that Hegseth is not. Hegseth is a rapist and an alcoholic, but he doesn't believe factual realities that don't comport with reality, which,
Except some of his religious views.
well, we always exempt religion from these things. We're required to by the Constitution. But Robert F. Kennedy believes that vaccines don't work, and he believes that the COVID virus was engineered to exempt Asians and Jews, right? That's,
Why do you have COVID now? That brings
I
up.
don't know. I feel like I should be a
Are you sure
beneficiary.
you're Jewish? Are you sure you're
It
Jewish?
maybe suggests that I'm not really a member of my people. Um, uh, Tulsi Gabbard believes that Bashar Assad did not use chemical weapons against Syrians.
And then
Um,
biolabs. in Ukraine.
And that there are U.S.-funded biolabs all over Ukraine, dotting the landscape of Ukraine. And Kash Patel believes that he believes that the 2020 election was stolen in the particular fashion described by Dinesh D'Souza in 2000 Mules, which he turned into a children's book. And so, like, these are people who actually have something in common in their own weird way, which is that they all believe facts that a normal person would look at and say that's delusional.
Or
And
what the Russians want them to believe.
well, delusional for whatever reason, right? And I think we're going to learn a little bit about whether the kabuki dance that Nastia described of the hearings is in fact just that, or whether it's more, or whether there's more reality to the process that we're going through. Whether there are more Republicans than three, including the now sainted Mitch McConnell, who are prepared under some circumstances to vote against Trump nominees. So before we wrap up, Steve, I want you to give us a little bit of a roadmap toward what you expect in this space over the next, like, you said you expect dozens of lawsuits or several lawsuits by this afternoon. What do you think a reasonable trajectory of the news over the next few weeks is going to look like in this space? That is,
I think some of it depends on Trump, and whether the sort of the administration doubles down on all of this, or whether it actually tries to look like, the memo was an overreaction. Of course, we didn't mean to turn everything off. It's all just temporary. The more that the status quo doesn't change, the more that there's no effort to walk this back, no effort to clarify that all the funding turns back on February 10th, then I think the more coercive the litigation is going to get. And, it would not surprise me at all if by mid to late February, there are litigants asking the Supreme Court to decide this issue quickly, and the court acquiesces. Now, lots of things can diffuse that, right? I mean, if all the money's turned back on and all we're fighting over is damages for while it was turned off, that won't carry with it the same urgency. But, I think there's every reason to think that this is more than just an accident on the administration's part. And the more that the more money that stays turned off, Ben, the more pressure there's going to be on the Supreme Court to resolve whether the president really gets to do that sooner rather than later. And I would say, certainly by March at the outside.
and you're, again, there's no doubt on the foreign policy side that it's meant to cover everything, right? So what you're saying has much more to do with the OMB memo than it does with what's going on at state and foreign aid.
That's right. Although, I think it wouldn't surprise me if the litigation challenging both, Ben, proceeded along parallel tracks. And if the Supreme Court actually thought enough of the foreign aid question to take it up separately, but concurrently, right, with the OMB question. Again, let's just sort of take one beat to note, right, that we're only about 16 hours into this mess, at least on the OMB side, right? Nastia, of course, the Ukraine piece, the foreign aid stuff is a week old. It is possible that this is just a really stupid overreach by the Trump administration, and they're going to walk the OMB stuff back as early as today. I'm not holding my breath, but we should appreciate that a lot, that we're still very early in the story, very early on the OMB side, still somewhat early on the foreign aid side. And so a lot can change, as early as today, that's going to affect how the litigation progresses.
And do you think that sorry, Nastia, were you going to say something?
We can wrap up with the thought from me, but
Okay.
keep doing.
And my impression of this is highly conditioned, to be honest, by the first travel ban order where Trump really seemed to enjoy the chaos. Um, and like the images of people at airports that being turned back that uh, most other people found shocking and upsetting. He, I think, was quoted saying everything seems to be going very well, and he seemed to enjoy it. But at the same time, the grown-ups in the Justice Department rewrote the order twice over the course of a relatively short period of time to get it to a defensible posture. My impression is that he will not, is unlikely to say, "Oh my God, there's chaos. That's terrible." It's more likely that he would say, "Oh my gosh, there's chaos. What fun!" But that there are, you know, responsible-ish conservative lawyers staffing the parts of the administration who are thinking about getting it into a more defensible legal posture. Um, do you agree with that, or do you think there's some reason to think this one is so broad and it affects so many organizations that maybe he's going to think, "Ooh, I kind of screwed up here"?
I mean, I think there's a way that he can try to persuade a gullible media that it's both, um, right? And to say something along the lines of, this is not a cutoff. This is just while we revisit everything. Obviously, we're turning most of this stuff back on February 10th. Everyone needs to chill out. Um, and that's going to depend upon people swallowing whole the notion that turning off billions of dollars for 2 weeks isn't actually a big deal, when it really, really is. Ben, the sort of the defense in depth point about the travel ban, I think, is really important. But I see that more playing out in the birthright citizenship context, where the executive order they drafted seems almost deliberately overbroad, in how it applies, for example, to folks who are lawfully present in the United States, so that then they can fall back and say, "Oh, okay, fine. No, now it's just about like that." Seems to me strategic. This seems to me clumsy. And if I were the president and I wanted to fight smartly about impoundment, I mean, I would have picked Ukraine. I would have done the foreign aid. I would have done the foreign aid freeze as the test case, and try to get Brett Kavanaugh and John Roberts to say, "Oh well, in the space of foreign policy, where we've always said the president has special powers, spending is different." If I wanted to actually establish a presidential impoundment power, the absolute last way I would do this is with an across-the-board spending freeze.
Nastia, you get the last word today.
Well, first I have a question. Steve, do you have Eastern European heritage?
I do. Yes.
Your last name sounds Eastern European.
All 8 of my great-grandparents are from Eastern Ukraine at a time when it was Russia.
That's so cool. So we're basically the same people. I'm gonna claim that.
Except Steve is Jewish. So
Hey Ben, we've had these conversations. Let's not go down that rabbit hole. If I see Ukrainian, I claim them, okay?
all right.
But on that note, I wanted to say that the Substack I published just an hour ago doesn't only have a depressing overview of all of this that we've talked about, it also has a list of organizations that you can support who've asked for funding help in the past few days. And importantly, all of them have content or produce content in English. So you wouldn't just be blindly supporting them for the sake of it, but you could actually benefit from it as well personally. So I'll send a link to the chat if people want to
And I will be, for those of you who do not subscribe to the Yours Ukrainian Substack, first of all, you should. And secondly, I will be reposting this list on Dogshirt Daily this evening. And so we will try to make this list of Ukrainian media that needs help and publishes in English available as broadly as possible. Folks, we're going to leave it at that. This has been a remarkably informative show for one that was put together at 7:30 in the morning, half an hour before it ran. Steve Vladek, you're a great American. It's great to see your face. You gotta start writing more of these things on Lawfare, your original home, and fewer of them on that Substack of yours.
I'll
Uh,
just jump in and say that Steve also made an appearance on Mona Charon's new podcast on Monday, and that was really excellent. And Mona's new podcast is really good.
And I just want to say the idea that you could speak that sentence, that Steve has appeared on Mona Charon's podcast, and that, by the way, the political differences between them round to zero in the current environment is a statement that would have been gibberish and incomprehensible only a few short years ago. Nastia, you're a great Ukrainian, and it's great to see your face. Not that I don't do that on a regular basis, but it's great to do it in public. Ev and Holly, thank you for showing up today. Yours from the COVID sick bed. We will be back tomorrow. We're going to have Jonathan Rausch on with Holly to talk about his new book on Christian voters. And
You guys haven't had enough Christianity, so
yeah, we got more
we're gonna keep
Christianity
pounding it. We're gonna
coming
keep
your
pounding
way.
I
Talk
could
to you tomorrow.
probably hop onto that to talk about how that ties into Russian propaganda and Ukraine and the US.
Well, you should certainly hop on. I haven't yet finished the book, so I don't know how relevant that is, but by all means join. We will talk to you tomorrow.